Welcome to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week I'll be discussing Dan Bilzerian's recent interview with Patrick Bet-David on the PBD podcast, where he shared his anti-Israel policy position or maybe sentiments and his overtly anti-Semitic ideas about Jews, the Talmud, and the Jewish cabal that he claims runs Washington, D.C., Hollywood, higher education, and the media. This idea or the scapegoating of Jews for a lot of the social woes happening here in the United States is not all too new. Candace Owens has also peddled a similar narrative. Her anti-Israel foreign policy position, rooted in neo-isolationism, is really disguising a deeper anti-Semitic sentiment towards Jews here in the United States. Those who seek to make America great again or push an America First policy initiative are susceptible or maybe even sympathetic to these more radical ideas, and it's becoming more mainstream in the cultural conversation on the political right. I recently came back from a trip to Germany where I visited Nuremberg, and the topic of this week's episode feels even more important to me in light of that recent trip. When I visited Nuremberg and saw the Nazi rally grounds, which was the hub of Nazi, political culture and fandom from about 1933 till the end of the war in 1945, I was struck by how organized the Nazi party was. I went to the Zeppelin rally fields, which were huge. They would be filled with thousands upon thousands and tens of thousands of Germans sympathetic to the Nazi cause. And I realized that the Nazis didn't have to radicalize the German population against their Jewish neighbors. There's this kind of question in academia of how did the Nazi party brainwash an entire generation or entire population of Germans to hate their Jewish neighbors? And as radical as this might sound, I actually think it was the Germans' susceptibility to anti-Semitic sentiments that was the gateway into them embracing more radical fascist Nazi political ideologies, which included relinquishing their own personal freedoms for a collective Nazi identity. I think that's happening in our culture today. Similar to the interwar years in America, we are experiencing political turmoil, economic hardships, and that really is the breeding grounds for larger cultural anti-Semitic narratives where the Jews become the scapegoats. In the interwar years between World War I and World War II, the Nazis in Germany were blamed for their loss in World War I. They were blamed for the economic hardships that followed. And similarly, today, the issues in America, like I mentioned, whether it be economic issues, mass immigration due to a poor and weak border policy, the pushing of DEI, of radical liberal feminism, of critical race theory, all of that is the Jews' fault. We are living at a time where scapegoating the Jews for medieval anti-Semitic tropes, such as controlling the money in the media, is becoming mainstream and popular. It's dangerous. When I walked away from Nuremberg, I realized that if we don't speak out against the growing anti-Semitism on both sides of the aisle, but particularly on the right, we might see ourselves in a position like Nazi Germany. This is the 10 years out. This is the 1920s and the interwar years when we need to speak out against these dangerous ideas. Our Jewish neighbors depend on it. They need us as allies. And as Christians in particular, it is our moral and religious duty to speak truth, capital T, to darkness. This conversation is important, and I hope you learned something. Me and Isaac are going to be kind of rebuttaling the claims made by Dan, but they're claims made in everyday life. I've had similar conversations with people in my own life or people I meet at protests on the street. So hopefully our rebuttals to Dan will help equip you in the conversations you have in your everyday life. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Welcome back to the Fearless Project podcast, Isaac. I'm so happy to have you.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
So this week we're going to talk about another figure in the red pill movement on the, I guess, conservative or libertarian leaning right here in the United States, Dan Bilzerian. He was recently on Patrick Bet-David's podcast, and they discussed, amongst many things, his stance on Israel. He's had quite a few tweets go viral where he espoused just very openly anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish sentiments, not just about Israel, but just about Jews in general. And we're going to talk about how we saw with Candace Owens, it was this catalyst. She kind of started this criticism of Israel and this just asking questions approach. And she's really evolved into just being more overtly anti-Semitic. Her rants, really, to be honest with you, the only other word I could think of would be almost these deranged rants about the Jews. And Dan Bilzerian has kind of been tracking with her. And I think it's important we talk about him because it highlights the traction that I think Candace Owens really started on the red pill right, speaking out against Israel and Jews. So for our audience who might not know what red pill is, what is the red pill movement, if you could just summarize it in a few sentences?
Yeah, so a brief summary is a movement among men. Depends on when you date it, maybe about 30 years ago, you could say it started, but definitely gained a lot of traction as the internet became larger. A movement of men disillusioned with modern feminism, what's taught in the educational system, especially in higher education, the message that men are, the masculinity is toxic, and that to be a man, uh, to have desires, to want to succeed and strive and enjoy competition, pursue women is somehow corrupt or has to be tamed out of men, essentially. So, my personal stance as a Christian, my view of biblical masculinity is I think there are aspects of truth that they pick up on because the attempt to essentially neuter men of a lot of the good qualities that they have, the same type of strength that can lead men to start war and try to accomplish tyranny, also is what inspires good men with a proper worldview to stand up against evil and defend. And we're going to be left with evil by both men and women for as long as we exist. So the proper cultivation and the framing of biblical masculinity is very important. So the truth they pick up on is the pendulum swinging way too far the other way to kind of devaluing men. But I would say where they go off the rails is they're not moored by a Christian ethic. Oftentimes, they will consciously adopt kind of pagan models, Sparta and other examples, where you can point to aspects of courage and masculinity expressed, but also a lot of negatives that come along with it, a lot of mistreatment. And in particular, with regard to women, they can uh, essentially instruct men who want an improved dating life or sex life to view the experience as a lot more transactional, play hard to get, assume all women are going to kind of exploit them or lie to them. And then their way of winning is to basically sleep with as many women as they can when they want to. There are nuances, but I think that's kind of the simple ethos. So by correcting one problem, they end up going to another end. And in the end, it's not going to make men any more happy. It's a brief summary.
No, that's great. And I think it really came to light on the internet around 2016 before the 2016 presidential election. And as you mentioned, Isaac, it's just a pendulum swing from the radical ideology of the critical theory left, third wave feminism. And it essentially peddles this idea that female sexuality, the liberation, is the greatest, I guess, sin of our modern culture and is the root of everything basically wrong with our culture. And the thing I think the movement gets wrong is that it fails to check the masculine. So it essentially endorses unbridled masculine sexual appetite, but demands virginity and virtue of women. Men can have multiple partners, women can't. And it's actually more, I think, likened to Islam. So you see the Tate brothers as one example, who converted to Islam because I think it aligned mostly with their lifestyle. I'm pretty sure Andrew Tate said that in a video. It wasn't necessarily initially for spiritual or uh, bigger reasons, other than it was aligned with his lifestyle in a way that Christianity was not. And we've spoken a lot about Candace Owens, but tying this all back into the current conversation on anti-Semitism here in the United States, Candace Owens, her original handle on YouTube was Red Pill Black. That's kind of where she got her start, was in this Red Pill movement. And really, another key aspect of the Red Pill movement is this idea of enlightenment. So it's even, nodding to the movie The Matrix. So you have the blue pill and you have the red pill. If you take the red pill, you're enlightened. And that's kind of key and cornerstone to this idea of the Jewish conspiracy, because when we look at Candace Owens and now Dan Bilzerian, they kind of are speaking from a place of enlightenment. They now see the Jewish cabal that's ruling our society. And so that's kind of the important cornerstone of the Red Pill movement, where I think this anti-Semitism is being birthed from. So we'll take a few looks at Dan's tweets. So here's one tweet that went pretty viral online. Um, For those listening, it reads Muslims aren't the problem. The open borders and the mother effers in the media attacking nationalism, pushing DEI, transgenderism, and destroying moral values are the problem. This got 3.6 million views. And again, this is why we're talking about this on this podcast, because while it might seem like a fringe idea, it's actually catching a lot of traction on the conservative or libertarian leaning right. So this is just one of his tweets. Here's another one of his tweets. He says, if you don't put America first as a US politician, you are committing treason. Supporting Israel is bad for America. Netanyahu is a convicted war criminal, and Israel is not our ally. We've fought way too many wars for Israel, and we certainly don't need to give them any more money. So this is kind of that attack on AIPAC, on the US Israel relationship, which again has gained a lot of traction within this movement with Candace Owens, an isolationist. Here is just another tweet to illustrate this. These effing idiots have ruined movies, meaning the Jews. Everything they put out is literal propaganda. So I don't know, Isaac, if you have any kind of remarks to some of these tweets, but it just tracks with what we've seen Candace Owens peddling and many others on the conservative right.
Yeah, a lot of problems with this, and it's interesting. It's only a strain of the right that will go so far as to kind of excuse Islam, because the other side of a lot of the nationalist right is to say it's okay to be have borders and a distinct identity. Islam is not uh, consistent with our values, at least as expressed by people coming from certain countries. You can agree or disagree with that, but that's common on the right. And some go so far out of this, like, I think, false admiration of the quote unquote masculineness of Islam, uh, and then can almost try to side with that. Um, but I think it's a completely misplaced foreign policy. And then he says open borders are the problem. But the relevant question is there anything different about, say, the influx of people coming across open borders in the wake of ISIS in 2015, 2016, which had hundreds of thousands of migrants go into Western European countries? Is that any different than if there had been, let's say, unrestricted immigration between the US and Europe, or um, Australia and Europe? You could pick different areas, and it's kind of reasonable to conclude that a lot of discontent has resulted from certain people coming from certain places. It's not to say everyone's in the same camp, but you can see a clash of ideologies. So it's kind of extreme. Another thing to point about this latest one, the use of the word they. It's a very frustrating rhetorical trick, especially when you try to talk to or talk about people like Candace and Dan here, because they have a fundamentally conspiracy mindset. And so the they is ever shifting. If you ask them, who's the they? It's like, well, it's the Jews. Or is it all the Jews? Is it the bad Jews? And it's like, well, they're in power. We'll get into some of these claims, but he throws out with utter confidence and literally zero citation of any evidence once statements like 95% of this thing is Jewish, or this or that. And almost all of them are just absurd on their face when you hear it. And with like about 0.3 seconds on Google, you can show that it's false. We also got into this with the Candace episode. If you talk about, like, okay, the Jews in DC, what does that mean? There are Jewish people elected in both parties in Congress. If you look at the top donors to political parties, a lot of them are Jewish, except a lot of them give to the opposite parties. They're literally contradicting each other. Who else does that? Caucasian Americans give to both political parties. Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans, everyone can be represented. And if anything, there's slightly higher participation on the left side of the spectrum historically with Jews, although that's shifted, and a lot of the very significant Republican donors are Jewish as well. So if this is some cabal or conspiracy, why exactly are they doing friendly fire, essentially? You would think they'd be a little more coordinated. But anytime you cite that about Israel or about anything, it's just like, well, it's kind of an anomaly, but they really know what's going on. Like, at some point, they're all talking back there. And when you kind of have that conspiracy mindset that is impenetrable to facts or logic, what we're going to do here is point that out. But this is for the benefit of the audience, because if you're basically engaged with a person like that, it's essentially irrefutable. It's an article of faith, essentially, for an expression of his grievances. But we'll go through in more detail why it's wrong.
Yeah. I also want to highlight this America First policy idea. Candace has also pushed for this. If you listened to a lot of the guests Tucker Carlson has on, is this idea of America First policy. I think that's birthed out of just the chaos of the last 4 years or even of COVID. And we're seeing the Jews become the scapegoat for that chaos. And there's also this false zero-sum idea that America First policy means that we can't support Israel as an ally. And we'll go through that a little bit. I want to look at one last tweet. This kind of speaks to his moral character throughout the entire interview, or at least the portion we're going to look at. He kind of takes this moral high ground that he's judging the Jews who are liars from a place of high morality. This is a tweet that he tweeted in response to something that Andrew Tate had put out, which is a Bible verse. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? Mark 8:36. So despite the fact that Dan actually said he was interested in exploring Islam, and despite the fact that Andrew Tate is a Muslim, he's quoting scripture. But what I think is interesting, and I would love for you just to comment to it really quickly as a man, a Christian man, is that Dan Bilzerian is famous and known for essentially being the modern Hugh Hefner. He's bragged about his sexual relationships and sex with thousands of women. There's an interview where he said he'd have sex with at least 3 women a day. So this is not a godly man. This is not a moral man. This is a man who's lived a very heathenistic lifestyle. And he's kind of had this moral evolution in the media recently. It appears that he might have exchanged polygamy for a relationship with one woman that he got married to. So I don't know if you could speak to that evolution and also just kind of this false sense of moral high ground that he brings to the conversation.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I would recommend people to listen to the whole podcast. He gets into a lot of his life story. So the first thing that occurs to me, there's a very good comedy set done by John Mulaney, the comedian, about Trump years back. And I think it's, in good fun, but he's basically saying Donald Trump is what kind of a homeless person's version of a rich person is. He's basically like, if I had all that money, I'd make a bunch of gold buildings and I'd put my name on it and I'd do this or that. And kind of just a funny way of saying, like, there's a little bit of a in-your-faceness about how Trump expresses his wealth. It's just a style preference. And I think in a similar way, Dan Bilzerian is like a 12-year-old boy, or really the immediate period of a boy entering adolescence, particularly with the awakening of sexual desire. It's a version of that kid's idea of what it means to be a man. As a guy changes, you notice women differently, you get more aggression, more desire for competition and success, and all of that is natural and healthy, but it's also needing to be tamed. In the same way, the analogy used in the Bible, the word meek, which is used in Greek, when it's expressing how we should be meek, is not at all about weakness. It doesn't have anything to do with capacity. It has to do with restraint. So the word in Greek was often used about war stallions and how horse trainers would train a stallion to be meek. What that meant is they're powerful because they have a lot of muscle and speed and ability, and they can be very successful in war. But if it's unbridled, if they're not trained, if they're wild, then they're basically a danger. So meekness is not about weakness. It's about a tamed strength and capacity. But the alternative of that is Dan Bilzerian essentially thought, I'm becoming a man. I want women. I want to be strong. I want to shoot things. I want to blow things up. I want to do all the drugs. And I'm just going to go crazy with it. There's no version of manhood that really fits. It's clearly, just on the face of it, even non-Christians can see it's psychologically unhealthy. It's physically unhealthy. But I think it's sad too, because what he ultimately realized was it was not fulfilling, it was not satisfying. But as he expresses that in this interview, and Patrick Bet-David, who's a Christian, asks him this question, like, did God have anything to do with it, faith or like a moral awakening? He basically says no. He admits no fault. He doesn't say it was bad or immoral. He said his ethics a few times is basically just like, do the right thing. Do the effing right thing. Just a line he repeats over and over again. But what that means is his own moral conscience. So he doesn't think it's wrong how he used women or anything he did or drugs or the lifestyle that had him have a few heart attacks and almost die. It's just like, I realize it's not ultimately satisfying. It's better to realize that before you die, and there's still hope for redemption, but it's not really an ethical stance. So I'd say maybe to his credit, he never claims to like have a moral awakening, but then he also illegitimately claims some kind of moral high ground to speak on these things. I'm not sure how doing all the cocaine and sleeping with all the women equips you to comment on foreign policy. Um, in Plato's Republic, there's a discussion with a man similar to this called Thrasymachus, and the analogy that Socrates uses to try to awaken this guy who basically believes might makes right. If I can take things, people, women, stuff, I will do it. That's the only ethics. He essentially says, like, so you think the ultimate power is to have all the desires and fulfill all the desires. But by that logic, you would want to be a catamite. And a catamite was a kind of disease that existed in ancient Greece where people would have horrible itching all across their body. But there's a view of that you could see, like scratching an itch, whether it's physical, sexual, financial. If you had all the itches and you could perfectly be scratched constantly for the rest of your life, would that be satisfaction? And everybody could see that that's shallow. Merely having a desire and having it fulfilled to some degree doesn't really get you happiness. These things can be all get you to unhappiness if they're excessively put there. So I'll just say, as we go through these things, he has no moral high ground. He has no authority. Even so, we'll still take his claims, and go through them. But there's certainly no expertise demonstrated and no moral character either.
Yeah, and pointing out his lack of maybe at least religious ethos is to highlight that, Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, they appeal to their Christianity as kind of cornerstone to a lot of the ideas they put forth about Israel or about even foreign policy. But that's kind of missing in Dan's case. He definitely lived a very heathenistic lifestyle. And for lack of a better word, it's a bit ripe, I think, that he comes to the conversation with that sense of higher morality without appealing to a higher moral code other than his own. So we'll see that throughout the conversation. I also want to highlight, kind of noting on his sympathies with Islam. You see that also throughout the interview. I wanted to touch on that because I think a part of the Red Pill movement, what makes it so susceptible to these anti-Semitic ideas and taking the side of the Palestinians or just of the Arab world within the Arab-Israeli conflict context, is that there is this sympathy towards the Muslims. He mentioned that he would be interested in reading the Quran and converting, and you also see that sympathy bias his view of the Jews and of Israel throughout the entire conversation. So this first clip is of Patrick Bet-David, who, as you mentioned, is a Christian. He's also Iranian. He asks him, like, is this a recent awakening, or is your position on the Jews new, or have you always held these beliefs and ideas?
You realize what a problem, comments you're making about Israel a recent thing, or have you always had these beliefs?
It's more recent. I didn't really realize what a problem it was until recently, and then everybody was scared to say something about it. My brother told me, like, you can't say anything about it, they'll fucking kill you. Like, everybody basically said that I couldn't say anything about it. And actually now they're like literally like trying to like kick me off the board of my company because of those tweets. So, like, shit, yeah, I've definitely had a lot of like negative pushback.
So right off the bat, I just want to draw some parallels between him and Candace Owens. So Candace kind of also makes a similar claim that this is a new realization. Now that they've seen this realization, they have to speak out against it. And the pushback that they're getting is just all the more evidence of the truth that they're espousing. And he even talks about, people wanting to kick him off the board of his own companies. It's kind of a liken to Candace Owens talking about being let go from the Daily Wire. So there's some sort of personal loss associated with speaking out against Israel. At least that's kind of the narrative they're painting. What are your thoughts on just his initial kind of awakening and this idea that you'll get killed if you speak out against Israel?
Yeah, it's a lot of thoughts. Also, it's just funny to see how many different people who get into these Jewish conspiracy things and say they'll kill you, they'll take care of you, go on massive book tours across platforms with millions of viewers and subscribers, and still are alive. Just an interesting thought. It again, another parallel with Candace is there's such a kind of whiny sense of entitlement about it too. So take the business aspect of being kicked off a board or something. Even if people on his board were agnostic about his views, if they have any interactions with Jewish companies or leaders or any part of their sales demographic, whatever the business is, are Jewish, a very simple business calculus could be, hey, we could have a guy who is good at business and spouts off about this random group. Like, we're a business, we don't have to censor you or take a stance, but objectively, you could be hurting that. And if it's a publicly traded company, then there's a financial duty that they have to not knowingly damage a company. And that's just business. Like, you almost want to say, suck it up, because you can't both have like this false bravado sense of masculinity, but then also cry victim when nobody's tried to kill you for what you've said. And if there are business consequences, then like take it. Then if you think it's this important crusade to go on, but it's a very crazy sense of entitlement. And one other brief point about the parallels with Islam. Again, there's logical reasons why Andrew Tate and Dan would find sympathy there. When Osama bin Laden's house in Islamabad was raided, they found massive caches of pornography. He had multiple wives. There was drugs, basically every sense of vice you could imagine. We know the example of the life of Muhammad also had many brides, and there are debates among modern Islam about what the true expression is, but certainly the radical branch that goes into extremism will cite precedents for their actions. The 9/11 hijackers repeatedly went to strip clubs and got drunk and all of the kind of things in their preparation mode. So it's basically the closest major religion you could find that an interpretation of which could justify excessive male desires expressed. And then also you could have the added benefit of being called courageous by your people, and then think ultimately after you blow up enough people, you're going to get 72 virgins. So it's all animalistic desires from start to finish. So it makes sense that if a playboy eases back on life a little bit and looks around for some kind of spiritual justification, that's the religion he would pick.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we're going to touch on the Talmud and his comments on that a little bit later. I think that'll be relevant to bring back up. Really quickly, this is just an example of Candace echoing really similar remarks in case anyone listening is skeptical.
To get killed. like literally, because speaking about people are like, Candace, beef up your security. I think it's normal, by the way, that basically every person who speaks about Israel has to basically say a statement that's like, I don't want to get killed. like literally, because speaking about people are like, Candace, beef up your security. That's not fucking normal. Excuse my language, but that is not normal. Okay, it's not normal that people have to think about their security because, and by the some of it, then the way that you get comfortable with it is you're like, they shot JFK in an open car, so there's not, he's a sitting president. Obviously my security doesn't really matter. If they want me, they're going to get me. That's not a normal thought process to have.
I would agree with Candace that her thought process is not a normal one to have, but not because she's talking about Israel, but because there's this sense of extreme paranoia. And also, as you said, there's almost like this self-inflated sense of likening yourself to JFK, a US president. So it's such an interesting kind of bent to their conspiracy, which is that they think the arm of the Jewish cabal is so far reaching that they're going to come and get Dan and Candace as if they're going to waste their time on that. But so there's like this great sense of conspiracy, but also as if like they're the heroes, as like you mentioned, for bringing this forth, and they're willing to risk their lives to bring this information to you. This is another clip where Dan calls Jews parasites. And I want to note this because we're seeing those who share Dan and Candace's ideas evolve from the just asking questions kind of tactic that Candace had initially started off her critique of the Jews in Israel with, to just being overtly anti-Semitic. You kind of saw it even in the delivery of her messaging in the last video. And that's a really dangerous place to be. And that initial video that we responded to, I think 2 months ago now, was just 2 months ago. So we're seeing the evolution and just the brazenness in which they're talking about Israel and the Jews evolve to a scary place in less than 2 months. So this is that clip.
It's one of those things where I know that it's the right thing, and the fact that everybody else is scared to say it makes me, feel obligated to be vocal about it.
Why do you think it's the right thing?
Because I know that they're a fucking parasite. Like, they provide the U.S. absolutely no value. They've done so many things that, would constitute an act of war against us. USS Liberty, Lebanon Affair, it can go on and on and on and on and on.
So you'll see this throughout the interview. He claims that the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is one that actually hurts the U.S. Israel contributes nothing to the U.S., which I think demonstrates an utter lack of understanding of international affairs and of deterrence against our enemies in the Middle East, which if you don't even agree with Israel or you don't believe there's justification for a Jewish state, at the very least, if you kind of extend your imagination, you'd understand how Israel is a key component in deterrence. So I just want to kind of address that, because throughout the entire interview, you see him him ignore that. But what are your thoughts on calling Jews a parasite or Israel a parasite, and his lack of understanding of the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Yeah, I'd say, as you pointed out, both Dan and Candace demonstrate almost like clinical levels of narcissism, and visions of grandiosity is another thing. Like before, it's just like someone walking into a loud room and say like, they don't let you say this, but I'm about to say this. And then people just like sit and look at you. And maybe eventually like they don't want to go hang out with you, but that's not you being persecuted. It just strikes me as such an odd stance. Even if I had a strident stance, I can't imagine like constantly posturing myself as like, but I'm going to get in trouble for this. Like, it's just kind of pathetic, but that's my personal take. I think it's also ironic in the Candace case, literally her former boss, at least in ownership of Daily Wire, was the largest target of anti-Semitic threats and one of the most targeted public figures in the country, like from 2016 on, by anti-Semites. And now she wants to say she's oppressed by Jews because they didn't give her an unlimited contract to spout off about her baseless conspiracy theories. That's being oppressed, to not get a fat, I'm sure hundreds of thousands of dollars check every few months or whatever she was paid. That's her being oppressed. And now the fact that some people object to what she said, she's being oppressed. And then she can invent a new thing that secretly the Jews are crawling around, plotting attempts to kill her. It's really like Borat level of conspiracy theory. If you guys saw the amazing documentary film Borat, where I believe they say they make up a country. I forget if he's supposed to be from Kazakhstan or a fake country, but Sacha Baron Cohen, who is Jewish, essentially embodies every crazy Middle Eastern Jewish conspiracy theory that Jews can turn into cockroaches and sneak around, and illustrates, I think, the absurdity of it in a humorous way. But also, I've had people to my face on the streets of DC in protests where they were supporting Hamas and Palestine say conspiracy theories about that level of coherence. So yeah, it's just such a weird combination of bravado, false moral courage, bragging about it, and then also making up conspiracies that you're going to be killed. And I just think it's a descent that they both have, especially Candace. Like, I think they're going to kind of spiral off into their own victim mentality, and there'll probably be a pocket of people that will be diehard and follow them through, but it's kind of sad to see.
Yeah. And I also want to touch on, too, it's so interesting, this fixation on the U.S.-Israel alliance. Obviously, it's relevant in the news, but you don't hear Dan or Candace really talk about Ukraine often, which is a recent conflict that a lot of our U.S. taxpayer dollars has gone to, in a much larger proportion than to what we have given to Israel in their war against Hamas. They don't talk about any other alliance we have, any other aid we give abroad. It's just a fixation on Israel, which I would argue is our alliance is one of the greatest U.S. alliances that actually contributes back to U.S. security and even the U.S. economy in ways that other alliances we have abroad do not. But speaking to kind of the conspiratorial nature that you were talking about, likening it almost to Borat levels of conspiracy, is his take on 9/11 and JFK, which Candace has also echoed.
I think they knew about 9/11. I think they had JFK assassinated. The first thing that he wanted to do, right before he died, was, make AIPAC a foreign entity, and not allow them to have nukes. And then all of a sudden, this fucking guy's dead. And Jack Ruby, who is Jack Rubenstein, I mean, it's just like, and then you just, I don't know, man.
So because Jack Rubenstein somehow ascended political power, JFK was killed by Jews for the purpose of protecting AIPAC and preventing it from being fair register, which we are about to talk about AIPAC, so we can delve into that in a second. But that just kind of highlights the conspiratorial nature. He talked about 9/11 and then the U.S. entering Afghanistan on behalf of fighting for the Jews. So essentially his claim is that the Jews orchestrated 9/11 to bring us into a war in the Middle East. Here's another clip where he talks about the lies kind of the Jews, and then we can get your thoughts.
I can't ignore all the shit that they've done. They sold our secrets. Netanyahu lied to us about weapons of mass destruction. We fought all these fucking wars. My friends have died over there. And I just look at what they provided us with, and it's fucking, it's not nothing. It's like a negative, it's not, even if they just didn't do jack shit, that would be, bad, but they've actually done things to hurt us over and over and over again.
Okay. So No substantiation of his claims, all conspiratorial. Again, he mentions he had friends who went to the Middle East and died, which is extremely unfortunate. But it wasn't fighting a war on behalf of Israel. It was fighting in Afghanistan, I'm sure in Iraq, following 9/11, the attacks against the U.S. on U.S. soil. There's also a lack of understanding of just geopolitics in the region. The fact that Iran calls the U.S. the big Satan and Israel the little Satan likens our interest naturally against those adversaries in the Middle East. But what are your kind of thoughts?
Yeah, first one on the fact checking. I was just refreshing my memory on the dates, but AIPAC was created in 1963. JFK was assassinated in 1963. There's a gap of a few months. So his claim is supposedly AIPAC was created. JFK was terrified about it, said he was going to declare it a foreign entity. I'm not even sure if they did a single significant act of lobbying in those few months. We can look back at the details of that. But it had no track record. It had no substantiation. It was way early on, but supposedly it became so terrifying in a few months, and then they took out JFK. Zero evidence for that. We went through the details in the previous podcast about AIPAC, how it does not fall under the FARA law. If people disagree, including not Mulvaney, the other congressman we discussed, investigations can be opened. Any administration can look into that. Like, it's not a hard process, but this is the nature of conspiracy theories. You don't really ever want to like do an act to prove it or disprove it, because then you can't use it as a talking point. But if you don't really cite facts and you just make it vague, and then you'd say, well, if we investigated, they would shut it down. They would do this. Again, it's a shape-shifting thing. So you can't really argue against an ever-shifting argument. There's no evidence for that. No evidence that Jews took out JFK. It's funny. That's even like a subset of the JFK conspiracy theories. And I'm all for releasing whatever records exist, but it's utterly absurd. Yeah, it's annoying to process, but
it is. It's also, when you watch the interview, I actually wish that Patrick Bet-David had pushed back against a lot of his bizarre claims. I don't even really think that PBD was equipped to respond to them. And that's kind of the nature of conspiracy theories too, right? They take an obscure moment in history, they reference a few people. And if you don't learn about it, if it's not mainstream history and you're not learning about it in school, or you don't brush up on your history, you're not going to necessarily have the facts to rebuttal it. Like, for instance, knowing the dates between the assassination and the founding of AIPAC. Speaking of AIPAC, let's continue kind of on that, because AIPAC and the arguments against AIPAC is cornerstone to this isolationist, foreign policy position that's emerging within the Republican Party. And I do think it's significant because until now, isolationism was a policy position held mostly by libertarians. It was kind of on the fringes, and it was never central to the political dialogue, especially leading up to a presidential election. So this is the first part of him talking about AIPAC.
Actually done things to hurt us over and over and over again. So like this whole thing of they're our greatest allies, just complete fucking bullshit. And, we send them $100 billion, then they send AIPAC $100 million, and then they distribute it to our politicians, and every politician is a little fucking AIPAC handler walking around and telling them what to fucking say and how to vote.
Okay, so really quickly, refreshing our audience's memories on our AIPAC episode. Israel does not contribute to AIPAC. AIPAC is an American lobby of American Jews or Americans who support their fellow Jewish neighbors in Israel. It is not a recipient of aid from Israel, although it supports Israel because it's in their vested interest to do so. So I'm going to play the second part, Isaac, and then we can talk about it.
Because China's doing the same thing.
China doesn't have they don't have an AIPAC. Like, Israel is the only one that has a fucking, a lobby in the U.S. fucking, giving these politicians money.
Okay, no, every country, the big ones all have lobbyists. They all have lobbying that they're doing.
Not in the U.S. They're registered as foreign entities.
Okay, so I want to touch on this. So I, before coming to the Fearless Project, worked for an international lobbying law firm in Washington, D.C., of which we had several sovereign nations as clients, which the executives at the law firm would represent on the Hill and would lobby on behalf of these sovereign nations. Saudi Arabia, China, they pour hundreds of millions of dollars into lobbying in the United States. There's this misconception that FARA registration means that they cannot lobby in the United States. FARA registration isn't like some blacklist that prevents sovereign nations from lobbying in the United States. They can lobby in the United States. They're just classified under FARA, which essentially tries to regulate or monitor where foreign entities are lobbying U.S. interest. And that's because sovereign nations are obviously harder to monitor than a super PAC based in the United States. So AIPAC, if they have 501c3 status, have to meticulously account for where all their money comes from, where all their money is spent. They file, all the filings are in the United States. Their employees are U.S. citizens. So there's actually more oversight for AIPAC than there probably would even be for FARA registered sovereign nations. So there's this misconception that FARA prevents foreign entities from lobbying. So here's one definition. This is from FARA's website. So I'll read it for those listening. FARA is an important tool to identify foreign influence in the United States and address threats to national security. The central purpose of FARA is to promote transparency with respect to foreign influence within the United States by ensuring that the United States government and the public know the source of certain information from foreign agents intended to influence American public opinion, policy, and laws, thereby facilitating informed evaluations of that information. So again, controlling sovereign nations is extremely difficult, and FARA was set up to help monitor that, although I'm sure it's not even a perfect process. Here is kind of an AI, which I'm getting used to using AI as a tool, but here is an AI summary of the sources listed on the site, including the U.S. Department of Justice. Yes, FARA allows foreign agents to lobby the U.S. government by requiring them to register. So I wanted to address that misnomer that he puts forth, because he essentially tells PBD that no, China doesn't lobby in the United States because they don't have a U.S. lobby, even though I'm sure there actually are lobbies of Chinese citizens who might lobby their representatives. They might not have an AIPAC or something the size of AIPAC, but China itself lobbies the U.S. government. And I even wanted to show this map here to highlight again just the irrationality of this fixation on Israel. Again, for those listening, I'm showing a map of Chinese-owned farmland in America. And they've strategically purchased a ton of farmland near strategic bases for our U.S. military. So if Dan wanted to talk about the dangers of foreign influence, China would have been an extremely powerful example of the dangers that has to our national security or an America first policy position here in the United States. Israel is not buying up a bunch of land in the United States near U.S. Army bases. So again, I wanted to disavow that misnomer that China does not lobby in the U.S. I believe almost every sovereign nation probably lobbies our U.S. representatives, including our biggest adversaries in China. And FARA registration does not mean that they cannot lobby. It's just a classification. So Isaac, I turn it over to you.
Yes, very well summarized. One of the most frustrating things to encounter in a debate is invincible ignorance coupled with utter moral certainty. And I say invincible ignorance because to the extent PBD pushes back in the podcast, Dan never acknowledges any of it. No citations to disprove them are ever cited by Dan. So that's what you are encountering with a conspiracy theorist. It doesn't matter what evidence you're shown. And if you're shown any contrary evidence, you'll be told that they, made it look that way. Like, well, how'd they cover this up? Because they can do that kind of thing. I mean, they're the masters of the universe. Of course, they can make it look like X, Y, or Z happened. It's just the easiest things in the world to fact check if you have a few brain cells to scrape together. Dozens, if not hundreds of countries across the globe have lobbying arms that operate here, or constituencies of diaspora populations that advocate for their country. So to make the analogy, Chinese Americans that live here and have citizenship are perfectly entitled to create Chinese Americans for a better Chinese American relationship. And that's totally legal, and they don't have to go under FARA as long as it is a actual grassroots thing happening by Americans, and they just want to put forward their views. And that could even be to say, we like the CCP, we want to have their system of government and all of that. But until you prove a link where they're getting financial support or material support, they don't have to go under FARA. It doesn't matter your opinions on what they are, because we've made a distinction that the right to free speech and expression, including through political operations, gives us the latitude to advocate for any causes we want. But the second a foreign entity gets involved, then you realize you're not just dealing with the opinions of your citizens, that you have a duty to. We have no duty to citizens of China. We don't have to respect what the Chinese government wants. So it's very logical to make foreign governments declare under that system. If he had any evidence to the contrary, or his allies that could get to people in government, it's the simplest thing in the world to file a complaint, get it investigated. It's never done because there's no proof of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very frustrating. So one last time to drive the point home, AIPAC does not receive money from Israel as a sovereign nation. They have major donors, they have small donors, people like you and me. Actually, not saying I've given to AIPAC, but not saying I wouldn't, but I could give to AIPAC today. And that is the grassroots nature of AIPAC. So the conversation kind of evolves. Patrick Bet-David does push back a little bit and asks him, why his evaluation of Israel is very one-sided. He doesn't condemn Hamas. He doesn't he justifies October 7th happening. And he also denies the rape of Israeli women and men on October 7th. He denies the killing of babies. So we're going to kind of delve into his sympathy with the genocide claim, the apartheid claim, and we'll see that in this clip.
So many world would be a better place if Israel didn't exist.
Yes.
Okay.
Israel's committed, so many terrorist attacks. They're stealing land right now. They're operating apartheid. They're currently committing a genocide on Palestinians. Like, do you believe in the genocide they're committing?
I think they're fighting for themselves and they're defending themselves.
Do you think that's defense?
Well,
when 1,200 people died,
Yeah.
of which the 1,200 you've killed, and admitted that you've killed a lot.
Okay, so this is nothing new. This is the Neo-Marxist claim that Israel's committing genocide, which is also really odd because we'll see this in a second, but Dan goes on to condemn BLM and DEI and the media's push for transgender ideology, which is all part of critical theory. But the idea that Israel are colonial settlers who have enacted apartheid on Palestinians fits in that neo-Marxist critical theory paradigm. So he rejects all other forms of social justice, just like Candace Owens does, but he's sympathetic to this narrative, which is quite frustrating. And so then we're going to see his remarks on what happened on October 7th.
The part I question, where people who are Jewish can't stand when I say this, I don't know how you, Netanyahu, claim you have the best intelligence in the world, Mossad, and you didn't know that on October 7th they were attacking.
They knew about it. They didn't. They wanted it to happen, so they had a reason to take that. Yeah, they wanted a reason to take the land.
I totally get it.
And they killed their own citizens.
So you even hear PBD saying, "I totally get that," and I wouldn't say that he holds like an extreme view on Israel or the war. And this is the dangerous part, because I heard this kind of theory peddled when October 7th happened. Obviously it was a huge security breach. I'm sure there's a lot there that we might not ever know of. But he makes the claim that they allowed it to happen so they could take the land. What would you say to someone who makes that claim?
Yeah, it's just wrong at so many levels. If you just, in that brief litany Dan did of using words, terrorism, genocide, there's a string of about 4 of them. Literally, if you look up the textbook definition of all of them are misused. That literally does not mean anything that you could legitimately accuse Israel of. But it's very convenient. If you don't ever cite facts to back up your side, then again, it's invincible ignorance. It's also, I made this point before, kind of absurd because it doesn't even give the credit due to Hamas that they sought. So much of the footage, which you and I have seen with our eyes and then been to some of these sites, seen the blood, bullet holes, burn marks. The footage we have came from GoPro cameras and other filming devices that the terrorists themselves filmed for the purposes of propaganda and circulated themselves. It's like you go on the street and shoot someone, video yourself and say, I, Isaac Woodward, did this thing and it's because this guy sucks and I'm proud of it and I'll do it again. We will commit many more October 7th. That's a chant I've heard also at many rallies here in the US. If you don't believe the evidence from the people you're attacking, Israel, and you don't even believe the evidence from the people who did the attack, said they did the attack, and they're proud of it because they feel no need to justify it. They view themselves as in the right, and they view themselves with the right to do these actions. At that point, you are outside of reality. You don't care what the people you're supporting say, and you don't care what the people you're attacking say. You have your own stance where you're trying to make this person more virtuous than they even want to be for the purposes of vilifying the other people. There's so many different ways you can refute that, but I think that's just one of the most obvious attempts. Why in the world does the side you're trying to defend contradict what you've said? Because they said they did it, they bragged about it, and threatened to do more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've been to the Gaza envelope in Israel, bus stops. I remember we stopped at a bus stop back in April around the 6-month mark on April 7th, exactly 6 months from October 7, and you can see bullet holes. There was still blood stains in the concrete of these bomb shelters that double as bus stops. So the evidence is irrefutable, and we see him kind of deny that a few more times. So here are a few more clips.
Rape, that was bullshit. They claimed beheaded babies. That was bullshit. Everything that they said was a fucking complete. Not only was it a lie, but they committed all those atrocities themselves to the Palestinians and been caught doing it. In fact, they just got caught gang raping Palestinians. You know, how many babies have they killed? All the things that they accuse the Palestinians of or Hamas of or whatever, they are guilty of 100-fold themselves. And they've been doing that. Like, October 7th wasn't the start of this. Like, the start of this was Nakba. They've done so many. I don't disagree. Yeah, I don't disagree. Yeah, so I mean, this is not like, it's not like October 7th is like, just all of a sudden they just came over there unsolicited and just killed people.
So again, you hear PBD saying, I don't disagree, which I think is important to track throughout the conversation, because I think he represents maybe the more mainstream narrative or thinking surrounding what happened on October 7.
Yeah, just one more point on that. You can see literally in the space of that clip, he contradicts himself, because at first he says there were no rapes, there were no killed babies, there was none of this. But then he says, but it didn't start on October 7th. And like, why did they do this? Did they just go randomly kill people? No, they had this justified reasoning. So in the same thing, he's saying, oh, it's fake. Israel did it. They did all this and it was made up. But then he also wants to give them credit on the Hamas side. And he says, like, well, of course they reacted that way because they have all of these provocations. So there's no logical ties even within his own mind.
Yeah. And I, again, really want to highlight his rejection of left-leaning ideology, yet he's peddling and embracing the mainstream narrative on the left of what happened on October 7th.
He opposes the globalists by spouting the exact same things which a majority of countries in the UN and the UN Human Rights Council are all saying. I don't know how you can claim to be anti-globalists when literally the definition of globalist entities like the UN agree with your opinions overall and your general aim. Takes a certain chutzpah.
Yeah, it does. Here's another video talking about October 7th.
Because you're saying it one-sided. You're not telling the other side of the story of what they're doing either. You're not saying what Hamas did. You're not saying what they did.
What did Hamas do?
I mean, from day one, when you see the rapes and the videos, we've all seen it. This isn't something
What rapes and videos?
But stay on this here if you want to continue with this.
But what rapes and videos?
But my concern when you're saying Israel's doing it, you're saying the other side isn't doing anything?
No, but there was no rapes during October 7th. They've shown no rapes from October 7th. They showed no beheaded babies. All that was all bullshit.
I'll send you stuff. No.
Okay. So this almost doesn't even feel worth addressing because it's just such a blatant lie. I actually pulled, so this is not evidence of any of that happening, but this is the POV style footage that we have from October 7th. There's tons of this stuff. As you mentioned, Isaac, this is what Hamas broadcasted. I don't believe that this footage shows anything graphic, but I'm going to stop it just in case it does for the audience. But that was commonplace. That's the evidence we have from October 7th. So we have firsthand POV footage from Hamas, again, that they were celebrating, they were broadcasting back home, look what we're doing. This serves as propaganda. We also have evidence of, sadly, of corpse of the remains of entire families wiped out in their homes. We also have eyewitness testimony. So this is a really good New York Times article entitled "Screams Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7," which is a mainstream media publication, which has not been supportive of Israel either. I don't think we could even remotely argue that the New York Times is peddling pro-Israel propaganda. And we have seen historically that rape is a weapon of genocidal aims, which Hamas states in their charter. And it was sadly a huge part of the terror that was rained on Israelis on October 7. So to claim that there's no evidence to claim it didn't happen is so wild. I don't even have the words to address it with any intellect. I think my rage might take over. So I'll hand it over to you, Isaac.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, we've shown he doesn't agree with the side he's trying to defend. He flip flops on if he's saying, yeah, they killed people and it was okay, versus no, Israel killed all the people. So he doesn't even understand in his own head. The thing that he's definitive on is that it's the Jews' fault. He hates the Jews and he wished Israel didn't exist. That's the only consistent line. And if you start with that premise, any example you're given, you come up with the theory that makes the people you hate look the worst. It's just classic bigotry and racism. It's sad. It's also the most ironic case ever for someone getting fame. Not only is he spouting morally repugnant theories with zero evidence, even the reason why he exists and has a platform is literally from living the most licentious, destructive life that even he got tired of. But a lot of people looked at pictures of him hiring hookers and doing cocaine and shooting guns. And now he's kind of slightly pulled back and people are interested to read his book. It's the least justified ever reason to get a platform, coupled with, as I've said, invincible ignorance and utter inconsistency.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to highlight that there is no evidence of a mass campaign of rape against Palestinians. Candace Owens also came out with a video about probably 3 weeks ago showing footage of Palestinian prisoners, terrorists being searched, so full body searches, which is a pretty standard procedure for any prison, especially a prison housing terrorist. And there was an ambiguous photo involving a search dog where IDF soldiers were holding up shields, and the accusation and the claim was that they were raping the Palestinian inmate. And I actually have a clip of that from the news.
Car security cameras was reportedly filmed in July and broadcast on Israeli news this week. Dozens of Palestinian prisoners are lying face down on the ground, their hands over their heads. In what seems to be a second video from a different day, a guard dog is barking aggressively at a prisoner surrounded by soldiers. 3 of those soldiers use their shields to block the view of what is happening. It is alleged a prisoner was being sexually assaulted by the guards.
So it is alleged. I don't know about you, Isaac. I don't see what is being claimed in the footage. It's blurred out. I do want to say that if that did happen, especially in an isolated case, because again, there is no evidence of this being a campaign or a standard operating procedure or something that is accepted by the IDF, it should be investigated. And if it did happen, those who would have committed such an atrocity should be held accountable legally. But this is their best argument. So Dan Bilzerian is saying none of the POV video footage, none of the eyewitness firsthand accounts, none of the bodies that were found with their genitals mutilated, both male and female, none of that is sufficient evidence. It didn't happen. But this obscure, hard to distinguish video that shows a one-off incident is evidence that the IDF commits gross atrocities against the Palestinians. So it's just this cognitive dissonance and this unwillingness to even view the situation from a nuanced or holistic perspective, which Patrick Bet-David does point out, that you're so unwilling to look at the side that you are supporting. It's so frustrating. And we see this again in the mainstream left even, but to have someone who is on the conservative leaning right kind of peddle a similar narrative is, I think, really destructive and scary.
Yeah. It's sad to see claims and at the very best a unclear situation are used as definitive proof of rapes happening, while actual video footage we've seen of that, eyewitness accounts, confessions, bragging about it, is not accepted. I mean, their entire purpose was to humiliate, terrorize, and instill fear. That's why they pick civilian targets. They've said this, they've bragged about it. But again, if you won't listen to either the people you disagree with or agree with, there's no way to refute it. But the other broader point is there's a even if it were proved that cases of rape happened by the IDF, then you look at 2 different systems. You say, okay, people are fallen. There will always be abuses or evil that happens. Is there any difference between a system of law and justice that explicitly supports and practices these things, which Hamas allows, They have no problem with rape or assault or anything like that if it's against the right people. They view it as a tactic of war and just a way to express their sick desires for pleasure, versus a system that, at least on the book, on paper, says you cannot do X, Y, or Z, and a system that has a noted record of prosecuting its own soldiers if there are abuses or war crimes or mistakes in the fog of war. So even if it was just a matter of what your paper laws say versus practice, this is better than this. And then there's the case of actually how the IDF prosecutes things. And if you can't recognize that, like, just there's no arguing with it, really. You just are going to hop around with selective standards and arguments to satisfy your preordained conclusion.
And in the interview, he makes the claim that this is all allowed in the Talmud and that Jews think that they're better than other people, that they're protective of their own. And so that religious belief in Israeli society kind of creates a culture in which Israelis can do whatever they want to Palestinians and there are no repercussions, which is not the reality on the ground. You just referenced codified laws in Israel. And I actually do find it very ironic that he finds issue with the Talmud and Jewish religious beliefs, but is then propping up Islam, which very clearly in the Quran designates people of the book as dhimmi status. So me and you, Christians and Jews, and then infidels, pagans, every other religion. There is a strict hierarchical system with Muslims at the top, and there is no tolerance for other faiths or religions. If you look at even Muslim imperialism throughout the Ottoman Empire, most Christians and Jews living in dhimmi status had to pay special taxes at certain times. We're not allowed to freely worship. And so it's just so interesting that he's willing to protect and peddle one side, which actually in their holy text does have a hierarchical classification of justice, and then looks at the Jews and the Talmud, and he's referenced some obscure verses. I will insert in the description below a great video that refutes that with the Jewish rabbi, because I'm not equipped to discuss that from a theological perspective. But it's so frustrating to see this willingness just to lie and to misrepresent even what both faiths believe and how that then is implemented in society at large and throughout history. I want to highlight this video. This is kind of going back to that moral high ground that he talks about, where he claims that Israel lies. So we'll play this.
Not the fucking most moral army. That's all fucking bullshit. You know, everything that they say, it's just like almost like, listen, when somebody lies to me, like if you lie to me, I'm not probably going to trust you again. You lie to me a second time, I'm definitely not going to trust you. You lie to me a third time, and I let you lie to me the third time, I'm the fucking idiot. These motherfuckers have lied like 10,000 times.
So this kind of narrative that the Jews are liars is one of the oldest anti-Semitic tropes in history, even thinking back to like Martin Luther, his book, The Jews and Their Lies. So I really wanted to highlight kind of the ancient Jewish hatred that he's appealing to. And that's what Candace Owens has also really appealed to on the right side of the anti-Semitism aisle. This next clip shows PBD kind of pushing back on him. And this is what I want to highlight.
I come from a place of, I don't sit here expecting you to tell me 100% the truth. I don't sit here thinking, yeah, Dan's going to tell me 100% the truth with whatever he has in his life. I don't expect that from you, because I don't expect people to walk on water. That's not my expect. I'm going to live my life. I'm going to live it with my life, but you can't think that China's going to tell us the truth, or Iran tells us the truth, or U.S. tells everybody the truth, or you think any country is going to tell us 100% the truth. But I don't know, man. I got a different moral code.
Okay, so again, that moral code that he's appealing to that no one else has but himself. What I think is important to point out here, because Candace also would talk about like the Jewish state, it was created by pedophiles to protect pedophiles. There's some insane claims that she's been making recently as well. But this idea that states are altruistic, or that states don't lie, or that sovereign nations don't use deception in the anarchical system of global affairs is just such an unlearned position for him to have. It's not the reality of human nature. We are inherently sinners, but also every state in the anarchical system, so every country in the world, is going to operate in their own vested interests, which, yes, does include deception and and lying. If you like, the way Dan's talking about it is like Israel has lied personally to him, and it's like a personal offense to his relationship with Israel. It's so bizarre to kind of talk about Israel as a liar. Of course, sovereign nations are going to be interested in their own self-preservation. That is the nature of the anarchical system and of the world, and even of human nature at a very micro level. I don't know if what you would say, especially because you're so philosophical about even just human nature, but it's such a bizarre kind of issue for him to take with Israel.
Yeah, there's multiple levels of this. I think, as I've said, no matter what I think about the individual or their motives, you always have to address the actual arguments. That's why we're taking time to listen to pro gambler turned playboy, drug addict, almost dying, sex obsessed dude on a random podcast. We take the time to address him because he's human, he has opinions, he's expressed it, and every argument I think is due, a valid assessment and then refutation if justified. I don't care who says it. It could be a serial killer or a saint. Ideas stand apart. Otherwise, you're just falling into ad hominem philosophy. That doesn't mean you always have to respect the opinions of everyone the same, but this is a large platform and it's been out there, so it should be addressed. Then there's the second point of, do they have any credibility morally to comment on ethics of war or sexual ethics or anything? He clearly doesn't, by his own self-admission. He lives by a standard of whatever he feels is right. It's kind of ironic he doesn't even really claim moral authority, aside from just like, yeah, I know what's right and I do it. And then there's the aspect of psychological motivations that you're getting to, which I think is important. Because even if you bought a lot of the claims, you could just ask, like, why are you so mad, bro? Like, there's a deep, visceral anger he has about it, which is outsized even if you believed everything he said. Do you really think this is the biggest existential threat to America? Like, bigger than China, bigger than Iran? Like, if you're going to spout off about things bad about the country or allies or whatever, like, it's just, by any definition, small potatoes comparatively. It's a fraction of the defense budget or, allied spending, and it's fine to object on it, but you just have to kind of ask what's behind that. And as I pointed out, through like the complete lack of logic, contradicting himself multiple times, it all goes back to his preordained conclusion. The Jews are bad. They're trying to get after us. Israel is an embodiment of evil and they're hurting us and they always lie. What do they lie about? Well, they just lie. They lie. Like, come on. In that litany he just did, he didn't even cite one lie they gave, which is interesting. So address the ideas here, like respect, the audience enough to refute them. But I think any fair-minded person, whatever your opinion on Israel, can look at that and see there's some kind of deep-seated anger and probably hatred there. And I think that's a tragedy for him. I think it is bad for his heart and soul, and I hope that he can get that corrected. But there's clearly an outsized level of hatred.
And I think you see that also with Candace when she's like, even in the video I showed you at the top of the episode, it's this like almost deranged, just vitriol and almost so much anger that she can't even get an articulate sentence out. And it makes me wonder, what are the deeper reasons for their policy position on Israel, which I think we've seen the movement kind of evolve from being critical of just Israel to Jews in general. I kind of want to bring this back to modern politics. We have an election coming up in November. And I also am really just interested in why those on the right are maybe susceptible to Candace or Dan's views on Israel. For example, I pulled up the comment section from this video. A ton of people agree with Dan, which is very interesting. Someone said, this dude is saying something I don't think Patrick is allowed to agree with. Someone else commented, there's only one thing going through Pat's mind, in quotes, how many dollars am I going to lose if I say the wrong thing, end quote. Someone else commented, for some reason, I'm finding myself liking Dan more than I thought I did before this interview. Someone else put, remember people, Dan Bilzerian will never kill himself. So alluding to he'll be offed for stating his policy positions. And this is the overall sentiment of the entire comment section let me see, how many comments are there? Of 19,000 comments. I'm sure there are some dissenting comments or critical comments, but this is becoming a mainstream position. And I think it's because the right is responding to the extreme ideological left, so DEI, transgender ideology being pushed in our schools, feminism, critical theory, critical race theory, COVID, the overreach of government policy with the COVID-19 pandemic. If you're a conservative, that was a specifically horrific period of time because many on the right saw it as an assault or an expansion of government power versus our personal freedoms. And so in this clip, Dan kind of echoes that. And I think that's the root of where people might get sucked into this very extreme argument that it's the Jews' fault.
Jews have all the money. I really don't care. I don't care if they run Hollywood. Like, my issue is, like, culpability with the people that are pushing these fucking bullshit narratives. The media is mostly Jewish, and the media is pushing this fucking DEI. Yep. They're pushing this trans bullshit. They're pushing they push the COVID fucking shit, right? So all I'm saying is I want you to be responsible for what you're in charge of. I don't care if it's the purple people in charge of the banks. I don't care if it's the fucking green people in charge of the fucking media. No, but hear me out. I don't care who the fuck it is. I'm saying if the media is the green people and they're pushing COVID and they're pushing DEI, they're pushing transgenderism, and they're pushing racism, and they're pushing division, and they're pushing a degradation of fucking moral fiber, I'm mad at the green people. Right?
Okay, so essentially, and I had to speed that up because it was a longer clip, but his claim is that he doesn't hate the Jews because they're Jewish, although I would say his just vitriol and anger throughout the whole interview undermines that claim. But he's claiming that because the Jews run the media, again, that like great Jewish cabal conspiracy theory that Candace has also peddled, and they control politics and they control our universities and higher education and they control Hollywood. Because of all of that, and because the mainstream media, which I think is a fair observation, they do peddle a particularly narrow narrative on the left, a growing maybe neo-Marxist sentiment that's becoming mainstream, that because that is pushed or peddled by the media, it is actually the Jews' fault because the Jews control the media. And I think this is where that seed of anti-Semitism is taking root in people who might not ordinarily hold anti-Semitic views. And even if you don't hold an extreme anti-Semitic sentiment towards the Jews or towards Israel, I think those who hold positions that are more conservative are more sympathetic to those ideas because the Jews are being accused of everything that they hate in modern politics. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on just the growing dangers of this, especially as the election looms near. I don't think this will take center stage this election, but I think in the next 10 years, Israel and these sentiments, if they're not checked, will be something that's divisive within the Republican Party and will become a mainstream debate conversation.
You can just see in the way he speaks about it, the use of the term they, and again, the hatred that he has, it's dehumanizing essentially because you can cite any issue you want and talk about a big Jewish donor or grassroots group that is for and against it, whether it's trans issue or guns or whatever. And you could just look at FEC filings, like look who gives what political candidates, and they're represented on both sides. Why is that? Because they're humans. They're not fundamentally different than him or us or anyone else. They're people. They disagree. There can maybe be majority opinions at times. That's shifted. There's support for parties that can vary country by country. But the second he said in there, I can hate the green people or like see them as culpable. No, you don't get to do that. In the same way, if you had a bad experience with a black person, you go on the street and you beat the heck out of a black person because you said, well, you know, this guy did this to me, like, so I can hate your people. It's the simplest thing in the world that a child could see that that's irrational and immoral hatred. But if it's the right group, he gives himself a moral pass for that. It doesn't matter that it's contradictory because they have this friendly fire of disagreeing on different issues. If you want to talk about sexual ethics, like the massive explosion in Orthodox Jewish families and education is one of the most stalwart opposition to those kind of practices. It doesn't matter. It's not about logic. The hatred and the conclusion comes first, and any issue he doesn't like will be singled out as the villain there. So, you know, we can kind of shoot down the red herrings and the issues, but it's a deeper soul issue.
I agree. In conclusion, Isaac, what would you say to a young man who is going into this election? And not that I think the issue of Israel will be a make or break policy position for most on the right. Dan even goes on to say, which is really funny, he asks him, like, who are you going to vote for after he accuses Trump of supporting Israel for the money and for the fame? And he's like, well, Trump. So it's like even this issue isn't going to sway who he votes for on the first Tuesday of this November. But what would you say to a young man who might be sympathetic to his policy positions and then just kind of accepts his claim that it's the Jews and the Jews' fault? What would you tell a young man your age?
Thankfully, I never really saw the appeal of his lifestyle, but I would say,
Yes, Isaac, for the audience, Isaac is like the example of what you should be, as which I think, and this is why I love having you on to talk about those who are maybe more right leaning, because being someone who's a more conservative Christian and you being a more conservatively leaning man, I think we have a responsibility to speak to the unhealthy extremes within maybe the party that we would identify with the most. So I think you're the moral example. So as that moral example, what would you say to a young man who might lean towards Dan?
yeah, I'll put myself in the mindset of, I think, who could maybe be persuadable to that a little bit. I was very rambunctious as a child, loved all the traditional masculine things, including sometimes in risky ways. Most physical danger maybe was what I was most susceptible to. Just kind of expressing desire for adventure in those different ways. And I could see a man or a boy, really. I think honestly, boys is the proper term. Even if they're 25, I don't think he's a man. I think he's a man child. And I don't say that to mock him. I just think that's the level of complexity that he kind of processes things. Even in his pulling back on his lifestyle, it's still hedonism, it's still selfish. He just kind of got burnt out on the other stuff. Um, I would say if you're hearing a mainstream narrative of sit in your classroom, listen to the teacher, like, recess is cut, don't be rambunctious, don't be too masculine. Girls have been oppressed, let them speak. If you're in college and you look around and hear constantly that women are the most oppressed, but then you see actually there's way more men dropping out, the amount of representation they have in higher education, degrees, a lot of other metrics of success is going down. Suicide rates are much higher, deaths of despair and loneliness. Like, it's legitimate to hear that mainstream narrative that, like, there's something deeply wrong with me because I'm a man or a boy, and that I want things. I want adventure. I want to get women. I want all of these other things. Those are good desires put into the proper context. In the same way that hunger is a good thing, it fuels us, it keeps us going. But if you live only to satisfy hunger, you will die. You'll become morbidly obese or get some kind of disease. And diseases of the heart or the body are different. Dan isn't currently, as we know, experiencing the diseases of the body in the same way. He's not having more heart attacks. He's pulled back on the cocaine and the excessive lifestyle. But the disease of his soul, which led him to seek those things, is still present in how he's speaking. So I would say, don't hear one false narrative and then go to the other extreme of another false narrative. They're both preaching falsehoods. I think it's good and virtuous to see your masculine desires for leadership, and express those. But if you're doing that in a way that is fundamentally self-centered uh, and seeking the next thing to kind of fill a gap in you, it will be an ever-failing quest. So pursue truth. Don't be afraid to speak your opinions, which Dan certainly isn't. But also don't mistake the fact that something you say is controversial to mean that it's true. You could say people should have a right to say X, Y, or Z. It also doesn't make them courageous to say a stupid thing, and it doesn't mean they're oppressed if other people disagree.
That's beautiful. I guess in closing, something that frustrates me as a conservative Christian, this is more for someone like Candace, who is a self-professing Catholic, or for Tucker Carlson, who's a Christian, is I don't agree with, and I believe that the oppressor-oppressed paradigm of the neo-Marxist left, the postmodern neo-Marxist left, is incorrect. It's based on a false interpretation of history. I think it's rooted in lies. But I understand if I was a secular feminist young girl on a college campus who truly believed that Israel was committing atrocities against Palestine, and I had bought into that narrative, and my social justice was my secular religion. I understand in that worldview, not that it's correct or not that it's justified, it's wrong, and that's why we talk about it here on this podcast, to speak truth to those falsities. But I would understand how you would feel morally justified to push back against Israel and call them a colonizer, and maybe even justify some of the things that happened. Again, it's incorrect, it's false. But what I can't square on the right, or people who maybe I would politically align with on a lot of other major issues, is within that worldview, we wouldn't see Israel as an oppressor. We reject that critical theory in all other policy positions and issues. But when it comes to Israel, they hate Israel because Israel is Jewish. Like if you look at Candace's arguments, if you look at Dan's arguments, even though he's not a Christian, the crime of Israel is that they are Jewish and that they are part of a Jewish cabal. And I think that is a really dangerous ideology because that's very similar to the sentiments held by many in the pre-war years of Nazi Germany and then going into the Holocaust. So that's why we continue to talk about this here on this podcast. I think, especially being a Christian and Christians who espouse that idea, we are called through our Christianity to speak truth. And I think it's extremely reprehensible that someone like Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson, who we didn't talk about today, but just speaking about this at large, would peddle this. It disheartens me as a Christian. So we'll continue to kind of track this conversation and this cultural narrative that is becoming maybe more mainstream within the conservative right. Thank you so much for coming on, Isaac. I can't wait to battle future crazy takes by those on the conservative or red pill right. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Dominique. Always a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Fearless Project podcast. If you would like to learn more about Nazi Germany in the interwar years and some of the medieval anti-Semitic tropes that was a gateway for larger Nazi fascist ideology, I'd point you over to our recent lecture by Dr. Whitney Bendick from Florida State University, where she discusses the Nuremberg laws and the institutionalization of anti-Semitic policies in Nazi Germany from 1933, respectively, until the end of the war. The Fearless Project is a nonprofit, so if you feel so led to contribute to educational offerings such as this podcast, I will leave a giving link down below. And as always, thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.